If you're looking for exercises that can help improve your ability to invent shaded forms, you'll get to see that in this video. Steven Zapata assembles abstract, flesh-like clusters to demonstrate how to make design decisions for rendering light and dark that you can apply to any form that you can imagine. Steven draws amazingly bizarre and creative illustrations, but his skillful shading makes them feel grounded in reality. If you want to learn some of his techniques, check out his course, Secrets of Shading, at proko.com/StevenSketches. This episode is a sample from that course, and just one of the many exercises you'll learn to help take control of your shading. Enjoy.
Let us move on from this flat side view of the organic shape, and let us instead play around with having these kinds of thoughts and these kinds of conceptions in actual perspective. Right? And when I say perspective, these little diagrams that I drew here, these are pretty light in perspective. They just have the most simple angles applied to them just so that they don't feel like they're completely flat on the picture plane. But let's move on to doing some exercises where we draw like this and we think about our shadows and our shading in 3D. But we're going to keep it still very simple. We're going to do an exercise that revolves around blobs like this. We're just not going to think about them in side view first. This exercise that I'm about to show you, this is really what I recommend that you do often to practice your shading. So while you're really trying to develop your understanding of shading, modeling, rendering, getting the feeling of light on organic forms, this is an exercise that you can come back to over and over and over again and practice in abstract to get your technical chops up, even if you're not doing it on a fully developed piece. So basically, just like the little fish-like forms that we did in the last example, I am just going to make, I don't know how else to describe them, but like blobs of these sort of teardrop shapes that look kind of like muscles. Now, something like that can be a decent start, all right? So this isn't like anything really anatomical. It's just these teardroppy diamond shapes that have bulges and little tails, and they interlock, right? So they're blobby and they interlock. Another might look like this. Even before you shade, these are kind of a good test of your ability to just make up and design interesting interlocking shapes, right? This isn't the most interesting thing in the world, but it's a little better, a little more exciting than something really boring like, just some like alternating balloon shapes, right? That's much less interesting. These have a variety in size. So there's a large one, there's a medium one, there's a couple small ones, right? This one's fatter, this one's thinner, these two are thin. Like there's a variety even within just the way the shapes are drawn. So this exercise introduces both just abstractly creating these interesting basic shapes, and it's going to introduce you to some shading techniques. So this is very simple. Basically, you're going to drop these interesting teardroppy interlocking shapes however you want, design them, try to make them interesting, and then you're going to do what we did before and imagine shadows onto them. So I'm just going to make a very generalized light source. So I'm just going to put a little light bulb up here to imagine our light source with. And then you don't even need to sketch in the direction of the light. I'm going to do it here just to make it clear. And you can in the beginning, just to give you an idea. So I drew a light bulb there. I didn't know I was going to put these arrows down. So as we discussed, this would actually be like a sunlight, right? Because the rays are parallel. The light bulb would really shoot rays out in that direction. You know what? For the sake of clarity, let's get rid of the plug on that light bulb and let's just put an indication of the sun. So it's the sun, the light rays are parallel. I know that the tangents are going to touch there and there on those extremes, right? And then I'm just going to make things up on this. So I'm not going to just follow straight through. So I'm going to pop out. I'm delineating the core shadow right now, as we've discussed. Just some designy shape to that, and then fill in the shadow. Now you want to practice your draftsmanship in this case, draftsmanship. When I say draftsmanship, I mean your decision making while drawing. I want you to work on your decision making while you do this exercise. So really decide sharply what is light and what is shadow. And don't let them overlap. Don't share any values between the light and shadow. And you're also going to make other kinds of draftsmanship decisions. So this muscle, let's call them muscles, these blobs. This muscle is interlocking here into this muscle, and I dragged a little bit of what I'm going to think of as a cast shadow onto the tail of this muscle that it is overlapping. So here we would have core shadow, there'd be an area of reflected light, and then a cast shadow onto that tail, onto the insertion of this next muscle. This muscle down here, what am I going to do? One of the classic mistakes that people make is that where they start on one form, they repeat this lighting situation everywhere on the form. So the mistake here, the more typical, less interesting draftsmanship would be, okay, the light shape on this first one that I did is maybe 2/3 light to 1/3 dark, right? So if I put dividing lines on this belly, it's not exactly right, but you can see that if I break it up into thirds, the width of this belly, 2/3 of it are light and then 1/3 is dark. So the classic draftsmanship mistake is to just repeat that everywhere. In reality, life is more surprising than that. So as I move from form to form, I'm going to try to come up with different proportional distributions of light and shadow. So this weird tail, this weird muscle that's down here, I'm going to decide that this one is almost all in shadow. So I'm going to leave a little spot of light, let's just say here. And then I'm going to fill everything else in as shadow. That is a draftsmanship decision. That is me seeking variety. And I'm seeking variety. I'm interested in variety on principle because life has a lot of variety and has a lot of surprises. So if I'm making stuff up, I want to get that in there. So this one, so this is mostly light, a bit of dark. This is mostly dark, a bit of light. This one, I'm going to go back to being mostly, let's say that it's still mostly dark and a bit of light, but I'm going to reverse the situation. So where here, it's 2/3 light and then 1/3 shadow. I'm going to bop the core shadow on this one so that it is 2/3 shadow and 1/3 light. Now notice that I am just making this stuff up based on experience, little pocket things that I've noticed in real life, right? My understanding that the light doesn't share the same proportion between different areas, my understanding that if it's 2/3 light here and 1/3 shadow here, sometimes on a form it'll flip when it goes to the next form, 2/3 shadow there, 1/3 light there. Those are all things that I've picked up from life that I've liked and to me seem characteristic and really reek of like being difficult to make up. And I'm just shoving them in there. I'm just inventing them in for the sake of it because I know if I find an excuse or have the bravery to just do them, they will make things look more realistic. Generally, the things that we think don't look convincing are lacking in these dither-filled, unexpected little quotidian things that are actually a big part of the way the world presents itself to us visually. So 2/3 light there, or 2/3 shadow there, as opposed to 2/3 light there. As we saw in our previous demo, the differences in the nature of the core shadows across these forms is giving us interesting 3D, three-dimensional conceptions of this shape, even though we didn't really have anything solid in mind, right? We were just making it up for, I'm just saying, like, I think it's cool when the proportion of the light to the shadow changes from form to form. I didn't really have a strong sculptural understanding of that shape, but wiggling the core shadow and making it do something, not just repeating the same things over and over again, is giving it a 3D statement that I'm understanding after the fact. And as we discussed in the previous demo, it can go the other way. You can have the 3D conception very solid in your mind first, or you can have a separate diagram that shows you in all three views exactly what the 3D shape is, and then use that to arrive at this conclusion. But it can go either way. And now on this top muscle, let's handle this one where it's a little sliver of shadow and that goes off. Gradates out, and then there's only a little more shadow here, and everything else is light. So it's barely any shadow on that top one. I've designed it so that as we approach the light on this form, as we go towards the light shapes are bigger. Not too much here, but you can see the decision that I made here to really minimize the shadow shapes on this light fulfills that little rule there. So light shapes are bigger and shadow shapes are smaller as we go towards the light. And on the bottom of this guy, shadow shapes bigger and light shapes smaller. So really some big shadow shapes, and the light shapes that are on the underside are just these little slivers, right? So that, it doesn't have to be that way, but generally, as you move towards the light, let things get more light filled and let shadows get subordinated, and do the opposite as you move towards the shadow. This will automatically help you get a feeling of light fall off, that something is approaching the light. You can also vary your lines in the same way. So the lines at the top of the form, let them fade off as they peak towards the sun or whatever the light source is here. So let's say, for example, this line that's here, since it's pointing towards the sun, it really doesn't need to be that. This paper is not the best for erasing, but I'm just going to lighten up that line so that it feels like it's lightening as it approaches the sun, as it approaches the light source. Same here. This is the basics of line weight. You see this in comic book art all the time. You can have basically no gradations, just partially delineated light and shadow with maybe a little hatching. But if the line weights of the silhouettes and the contours follow this rule, they'll still communicate the lighting slightly. And then down here on the bottom, I let my lines get very dark because they're moving away from the light. You have a basic meat spear there, or something along those lines. And this is where you need to start, just mapping the simple light shape against the simple shadow shape. So let's flatten this down slightly more. And then, since I'm showing you how to do this as a real rendering exercise, this paper is good for getting a fast render, but it's a little, you'll see it gets a little grainy once I start modeling in the light. But the principle is there. Get nice flat shadows, and then like we did on our diagram before, you're going to darken the core shadow even more, and look for some edges. Look for where you soften and where you sharpen the edges on these forms. Now I'm just doing this very gently with the side of my pencil. You can see it's kind of been worn down from flattening the shadows, so I have a bit of a chisel tip. I'm just using the softer, blunter side of that chisel tip to lay in just the slightest edge variations and imply the halftones. Not rushing here. Sharp there, very soft here. And then look to darken the interactions, intersections between the muscle shapes, even in the shadows. That will help. You see, by darkening those guys, that makes this general area feel like it has reflected light bumping into it, right? Darkening those intersection points, which will automatically open up the reflected light feeling. On these large areas of shadow, just like we did on the fin of the previous demo, letting those have a little gradation of dark to light to help them get a feeling of reflected light. And that is really all that you need to practice your shading. You can see that it's communicating what you need to start being convincing. And then it's at this point, if you want to start getting a little more rendery, you can take something like a stump or a harder pencil, and you can go in and start rendering in the light. When you do this, remember our rule that the light needs to be compressed, right? So everything you do in the light is much lighter, much more compressed, much more subtle. And it needs to sit on top of this solid conception of the edges of the shadow shape interacting with the light shape. So you can take a regular hardness pencil, this one is very, very soft, so it puts down super dark blacks. This one is a medium hardness, so I can get some nicer grays out of it. And use it to roll slightly out of the shadows and just do a little bit of rendering at the ends of these muscle bubbles. Or you can use the stump. If you use the stump, the number one thing to remember about the stump, which is an excellent tool, it is an amazing tool, but it ruins almost everybody's drawings, and there's a simple reason for that. When people take out the stump and start rubbing it all over their drawings, they tend to go into a mode where they say, I am now softening things. I am now shading things. I am now rendering things. Mostly people think, okay, now I'm softening things, and softening means I'm going to get good shading, right? No, not at all. Zero. Never. It has never once happened. When you hold the stump, you must not stop drawing. When you use it on the forms, you must follow the direction of the forms, and I would advise you to always stump out of the shadows towards the light and be very conservative with it. You never want to stop drawing. You're still making shapes, you're still making interesting forms, and you are reacting to the forms that you have put down. Keeping that mindset will help you use the stump effectively. As soon as you forget, you space out, and you just start softening the stuff that you've already put down, you'll kill it. It kills it every time. So I'll go subtle here. Notice that I'm staying right near the core shadow. I'm pressing pretty hard around the core shadow. And then as I move up out of the shadow, I'm going much lighter, trying to barely change the value. And I feel like I'm drawing. A good thing about the stump is that you can create subforms on these forms. So see how this has a curve, this core shadow, and then there's like this little softer part, and then it goes sharp? I could take that cue to make like a little sub insertion, almost like a muscle belly going into its tendon. You can see that gives me a little bit more complicated of a shape. Barely a touch with the stump to get that shape. And you really don't want to do more to it than that. And it was a drawing move, right? It has nothing to do with softening. Here where it's dipping under, I'm letting it occlude the light shape a little bit, letting the light shape gradate as it dives in, to really make it feel like it's moving away from the light. Passing it over the shadow shape in general, to sort of flatten the shadow shape a little bit. If you've never used one of these stumps, by the way, they usually come either like this, like they look like they're rolled at the tip, or you get these bigger ones that really don't look rolled. They just seem like solid paper, Any of these are fine. These are dirt cheap. They're at every art store. I mean, don't pay more than $2 for a pack of 5. There's no better or worse versions of stumps. They're literally just paper. You can make your own. You can just roll paper and use that. You can also get a great effect out of using your finger too, but you got to be careful because the oil from your finger can build up on the page, and then if you want to go back over that spot and render, it can make it kind of slippery under your pencil. So it's not that bad, and it doesn't always happen, but it's annoying enough when it does build up bad that I tend to just avoid it and use a stump. Same goes for your kneaded eraser. If your kneaded eraser gets very dirty, it can deposit hand oils or leave some of its own. I'm not even sure what kneaded erasers are made of. Whatever that clay-like gunk is that they're made of, it can leave some of that invisibly on the surface. And then when you go over it with your pencil will get caught on it, and it can kind of ruin the surface on that spot. I'm using a tiny stump because there's some tiny core shadows here that I don't want them. Remember, I'm always hunting for the sharpness, the difference in sharpness and hardness of these edges. So I'm using this soft one because this is a small drawing, and there is hard edges, hard core shadows that I want to stay hard, so I just need a very small stump to get them. All right, and there you have it. If this were some part of a crazy tentacle that you were drawing or something like that, you would have this as a base, and then you would just kind of go crazy and start drawing, I would definitely hit this point first, right? Like the solidity of the shape, of the volume, of the rendering, the solidity of the shading lives in this very basic first pass. That is just light shape, shadow shape, and the edges therein. It lives there, and then the details just sit on top. So if this was like a tentacle, you would then move out of here and start doing some gross wrinkles, letting them get lighter as they move into the light. right? That controls your contrast hierarchy. You want everything in the light to get much lighter. You could sort of get skin-like textures of pebbles coming out of the halftones. You always want to relegate your textures to be strongest here in the halftone, just like everything else. Because think about it. If we are looking at, let's say, a curved form here, and the light is coming in perfectly from the side, right? And there are bumps of all different sizes. You know, we're zoomed in. There's freckles and pimples and stuff like that. The light is hitting these guys down here much more directly and getting much more light into them. As the light hits these that are right where the core shadow would be on this shape, it's these little bumps are actually going to cast longer shadows behind them and create more dramatic heights. So the textures are always biggest right where the light is grazing. The texture is most noticeable right where the light is grazing any form. So on something like this, if it was like an octopus tentacle, I would want to go pretty gentle with the texture out here. You know, I can still get it in there. It just has to be subordinated, and then let it stand out the most down by the core shadow. And then you can see the process of detailing really becomes a process of putting stuff in, seeing how it sits in the light, saying, okay, I did it either too light or too dark, where it's competing with the transition between the light and the shadow. And then you need to make design decisions. You're like, all right, I either lighten the texture to make it fit into the lighting scheme, or, and this is usually what winds up happening for me, especially because I work in pencil, which fights against you to go dark, is every time you add details in the light that you like, but are competing with the shadow shape, you need to then go into the shadow and re-darken the shadow to get it to really dominate as the head of the contrast hierarchy. And then that becomes the back and forth. That really becomes the big fight of trying to finish and shade beautifully a drawing. It's finding stuff in the light, letting it be interesting, and then darkening the shadow, darkening the shadow, darkening the shadow to get everything to sit properly and hold its place in the value hierarchy. And then carving back and forth and looking for interesting shapes. But that is the basics of how you arrive at a nice, formy feeling shading. And this is an exercise that you can do a lot. You'll get tons of mileage out of this exercise. You know, you don't have to have a crazy picture figured out to practice your shading. You can just do these sorts of tentacles, these blobs, and you get great practice out of it. And then you just apply this onto your drawings, you know? So let's do a few more.
Check out his course, Secrets of Shading, at proko.com/StevensSketches.